This is a short video on the basics of one-point perspective. We're going to start from the very beginning here and kind of work through the steps that are related to our assignments. To begin, what I ask you to do is start with a horizon line. And so basically at this stage, we're not going to do anything too fancy. And so I would just go ahead and kind of keep it towards the middle of your page. Now the important part with your horizon line is make sure that it's parallel to your picture plane. Obviously with the software I have an advantage. It's very easy to kind of draw straight lines or align at any angle you want. But when you're drawing on your page, really focus on kind of keeping that parallel. If nothing else, you want to keep the box shapes, the width portion of them parallel to this horizon line. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but by keeping this line parallel to the edge of your page, it's also a little bit easier to keep the sides or the height in one-point perspective parallel as well. And this all becomes kind of increasingly more important as we go on through the course. And so this is kind of a tip about best practices and to ensure that we don't run into problems later on because of what will later be kind of determined to be a craftsmanship issue. So now that we have our horizon line, we can basically pick a vanishing point. And in one-point perspective, obviously there's just one vanishing point. And I say obviously because at this point I do expect that you've kind of done the reading. And a lot of my feedback will be based on the assumption that you understand the reading unless you've asked questions about it. And so do take the time to do it. It's very helpful. It's really just make sure that you have an understanding of the terminology that we'll be using and the basics of how to execute these. Mistakes will be made. Revision process is there to allow you to change those before the end of the week. I do expect people that run into problems to use it. But this session we're going to try to do more of these videos where we will have this kind of step by step. Once we have our vanishing point and our horizon line, we can start to think about the shapes. And as we mentioned in one-point perspective, the height lines are parallel to the picture plane. And the width line. So this is the height, this will be the width. And something that you'll see me do in a lot of videos, and let's go ahead and start here doing it, is we're going to use green lines for guidelines, and we'll use blue lines for darkening in objects. Get on the right layer there, bear with me 1 second. And so we'll go ahead and start to do that now. If you're not familiar with what a guideline is by the end of this assignment, please let me know. It's something that we need to be very familiar with. But basically another way to think of a guideline as I kind of finish out this front plane is to think of it as a construction line, a line that you're using to start to build a shape, something more specific. With most of what we do, we will start with box shape, so it's kind of the core of what we need to understand. And so there's our front plane. And so when we start to think about this idea of depth and perspective, this is where our vanishing points come in. As a side recedes, what we'll find, especially with straight box shapes, which is all you need to be concerned about right now, is that the sides will recede back to the vanishing point. So this top right side, I'm going to take it back. The left top corner goes back. And this is going to be true whether it's 1 point, 2 point, or 3 point, that any side receding away from the viewer recedes back to a vanishing point. So this is kind of our first step. From here we decide how far back this shape goes. And so I'm not going to make this shape real deep, and I want to go ahead and create this rear back portion, or this rear back right side. And so I'm going to start here on that guideline that's receding back, that's representing our depth, and create a height line. I'm going to work my way around the shape. You'll see a lot of times I tend to start with a height line. I think that's very important to do in 1 and 2 point perspective. In 1 point perspective mainly because it helps in 2 point perspective. Not that there's any real value to it in 1 point perspective because you could easily just start with a width. But by doing it a height line initially here, when we get to 2 point perspective, it'll make it easier. And so that's one of those things I would ask you to try to approach kind of with my recommendation. And so we're going to continue to kind of work our way around. And so initially you should start to get a sense of what this shape is. And so let's go ahead and draw this shape as a transparent shape. And to do that, we darken in all the sides that would be visible to a viewer if this was, say, a glass box. And so to do that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to blue lines. I'm going to just reuse that one. There's no reason to draw it. And so this is what you'll do with your 4B pencil or 6B pencil. Start out with your darkest pencil at this stage. Later on, we'll play a little bit around with the values to some degree. But at this stage, start out darkening with your darkest pencil. And so I'm going to darken the sides that we have receding back to our vanishing point. And so notice when we're thinking about something receding, in this case the depth portion, this line, if I extended it back, would go straight back to the vanishing point. And that's part of the role the guideline will play, is to show that that line is not changing angle, that we're not doing something where if we have a back corner, we're going off of the guideline to some other point. We'll see this from time to time. That's not going to be correct. We want to see all these lines extend straight back to the vanishing point. And this is a key part of how these vanishing points are used. And so continuing with our sides that are receding. And so notice you can see the blue line, and if you extended it, it basically becomes the green line, and then the green line goes straight back. The green line will be your lighter value, or your 2B or HB pencil. Notice I didn't worry about that green extension there. Again, those are construction lines. They don't need to be perfect. You do want to have good craftsmanship to where they're straight and parallel to the picture plane as needed, but they can go beyond the length you actually need. This is where darkening in becomes. And so that's our first 1-point perspective box and how to create it. The other element that you have is the triangular prism, and that's something that is covered in another video, but we're going to go ahead and briefly look at it here. And so let's go ahead and use this side down here. And so part of why I talk about drawing it in as transparent shape first, and I'm going to kind of talk as I do the initial box shape, is that later on when we get to shadows, you really need to know where these back corners are. Had we not done this back edge here, the one I'm kind of tracing over, if we were trying to do a shadow from it and it was on the ground plane, we wouldn't have this corner, and we would need this. Later on when we do shadows, it's going to be very important to know where objects are on the ground plane. At this stage, we're not doing that yet. We'll look at that much closer in the upcoming assignment 3 of week 1. But for right now, we don't need to get kind of ahead of ourselves. We want to focus primarily on how the vanishing point is used and how we use these box shapes to create other shapes. And so you can see I'm being very careful kind of to get my lines parallel. Often when I'm doing quick reviews, I'll be a little bit rougher, but with this being the first one, I want to show that care and patience that's often needed to get them in the correct direction. Just as kind of a side note, I'm actually trying to use my right hand. My left hand is in a cast, and so I am going a little bit slower. As I pick up pace, or as you see me in videos, that'll kind of explain why we see that in some of these, that they go a little bit slower. And so now we're starting to get another box shape, and we're thinking about the idea of a triangular prism. And so a triangular prism, to make sure that the angles are consistent in both the foreground and background, we need other reference points. And so in this case, I'm going to pick a point along the top edge, and at this stage, it's a fairly arbitrary decision of where this point is. Next week, we'll look at centering it. But for this week, it's an arbitrary decision, and we're going to create that front plane of our triangular prism. This point here, to figure out where it is on the top edge of the rear plane, we create a guideline from this point back to our vanishing point. Where it intersects here, that's the top of our triangular prism in the back. Because we use the bottom corners, I can use those as part of our box shape, because we know our box shape's in correct perspective, and connect them. What happens now are that these angles are consistent in both the foreground and background, and this will be something that I'm looking for this week and throughout when we do triangular prisms. Ellipses and cylinders are going to be a little bit different, but they're very similar premise, so this is getting us headed in the right direction for those. And let me go ahead and darken this in as a transparent shape as well. And so the last thing we're going to look at is this idea of diminishing size, and to demonstrate this, what I want to do is do what another video calls objects in series. And basically the idea of objects in series is a way for you to reuse guidelines so that you're not kind of flooding your image with just a million guidelines, which can get out of hand, especially as we get into measurement work during week 2. So being aware of that now can be helpful. And so I'm going to use this box shape, and I want to create one more box shape in the background. And so I'm going to go to this top right edge that's receding, and I'm going to start with my height line again, and I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to switch it back to green to replicate your idea of a lighter value. And now we can do the width. Again, going back to the corresponding guideline. If you have trouble following the guideline, just be patient and kind of double check yourself. So we know this green line is the top left edge, and this green line is the top right edge, and I want to create a top edge for this front plane of this next box I'm going to do. Now we can bring it down, back across, and now this is our front plane of our next box shape. We go back our sides, which are already created, so we're reusing those. We connect those edges. So this is the top right edge, this is the bottom right edge. I'm creating a height line between the two that gives us the right rear side. And then the same process of kind of working my way around those box shapes, or those guidelines to create our box shapes, excuse me there. And so then we can darken this in. And what we get is some control over the number of guidelines, basically saves us time, and helps further emphasize this illusion of depth, because the scale of at least the height and width of this box shape is similar or relates directly to this front box shape. We'll later look at how to maintain depth in week 2 through measurement work. Again, that's kind of getting ahead of us, but just to give you some insight into where we're going. And so we'll darken this in. And so hopefully you have kind of a good idea of what's expected with this first assignment. We've looked at the basic box shape. We've looked at the basic idea of how to use a vanishing point. We've looked at maintaining angles through a triangular prism, using guidelines and using the box shape as a starting point. And so we've covered most of the basics at this stage. And this, if you can manage this and get a good understanding of it, it will be a lot easier to kind of move forward through these first 3 weeks. This use of the vanishing point is the basic core of what we need to know for this assignment. And so try to focus, especially on feedback to others, on how that vanishing point is used. If it's used incorrectly, giving advice on how you understood it, whether it was this video, whether it was a textbook, whether it was lecture material, whether it was some supplementary material, external resources like the Foundation Student Resources page, whatever you found most helpful, share that as part of kind of your comments. Make sure that kind of understand it. I don't expect this to be a one-stop solution for the assignment. It's really meant to be in conjunction with all of those other resources that I've just listed. So be familiar with them. The more you kind of have that base knowledge, the easier it'll be to come in and do these assignments, and especially later drawing assignments, which can take hours. You don't want to spend hours on something where you're not kind of well informed of what's inspected. And while this is kind of a quicker image, I don't expect it to take a whole lot of time. It can take upwards to an hour or a little bit more if you go kind of slower or struggling with some of the details. But that's time well worth it. The better we can understand this use of the vanishing point, the less problems we'll have moving forward.